For a long time, PC role-playing games thrived on delivering players deep and rewarding gameplay. But as the 1980s came to a close, it was clear that, in order to survive long-term, the genre had to adapt to the whims of a newly emerging PC consumer base, one that was less hardcore than those who had helped to create the scene in the first place. In this challenge to adapt, development studio Nihon Falcom saw a golden opportunity for role-playing games, and they decided to create a new game that promoted the idea of kindness towards the player, which they believed would help them capture legions of new fans. The result of their efforts was Ys, and it was soon followed a year later with the sequel, Ys 2. The second game built upon all the groundwork laid down by the first, and more importantly, it concluded the story arc. Both games ended up being huge successes for the company, but the quick back-to-back development times left the team responsible with little time to breathe. This was then compounded by some internal issues at the company, and it led to the next game in the series being very different when compared to its predecessors. Throughout this video, we will cover the changes in the broader video gaming landscape that influenced how and why Ys 3 was made, the key players involved, and why specific design philosophies were adopted, and what happened in and around the game's launch. But if you're a massive Ys fan and want an even deeper breakdown, which will go into much more detail about the game's legacy, be sure to check out our Patreon for the extended Director's Cut edition of this video. Plus, you'll also get access to extended Director's Cut editions of our videos on Ys 3, Ys 2 and Phantasy Star 2, early access to episodes on Mother, Dragon Slayer, Legend of Heroes and the First Saga, and exclusive bonus episodes on lesser known games like Hyderlight and Destiny of an Emperor. But without further ado, this is the story of Ys 3 Wanderers from Ys. With the first two Ys games, Nihon Falcom had successfully found a way to break into a new market of game enthusiasts by catering to players outside of the hardcore demographic. These games had taken the idea of being kinder to the player and just ran with it, providing quality of life features such as regenerating health, a fast and straightforward character progression system, and a save anywhere feature that set the Ys series apart from its competitors. What's more, the Ys games featured high quality visuals and sound design, and these were aspects of presentation that endeared them instantly to legions of fans. But with two titles now under their belts, and the story that Tomoyoshi Miyazaki and Masaya Hashimoto had set out to tell finally wrapped up, the question that remained was where the series would go next, as things were changing rapidly both within Nihon Falcom and in the broader video gaming industry. Because with the 1980s drawing to a close, the power players in the emerging landscape all started to make aggressive moves. Outside of the release of Ys 2, 1988 had been a big year for the role-playing genre. Both Final Fantasy II and Dragon Quest III had been released for the Famicom, in addition to ports of Falcom's own Ys The Vanished Omens and Azteca 2, Templo del Sol for Nintendo's home console. Though Nihon Falcom's main development efforts were still squarely focused on the PC-88, their foray into the world of home consoles by way of third-party porting jobs showed that there was at least some acknowledgement that things were changing in the games industry, and that home consoles were beginning to muscle into and steal market share from the previously dominant arcade and PC markets. However, the founder of Nihon Falcom, Masayuki Kato, was steadfast in his belief that the PC was the key to the company's success, going so far as to tell others that NEC's PC-88 was the only platform worth developing for. He therefore sought to ensure that his development teams were always working on something for that particular piece of hardware, because he was worried that they would lose the controlling stake they had worked so hard to build up. As a result, this left many of the developers with little time to reflect on things between projects. For example, their flagship series, Dragon Slayer, now had 5 main entries, not to mention all the expansion content. And all of this had been developed in just a 3-year span between 1984 and 1987. What's more, the majority of this work was headed up by just one man, Yoshio Kiya, whose own development ambitions were becoming increasingly at odds with Kato's. Kato seemed intent on doubling down on what generated the most guaranteed income, and Kiya, who wanted to work on different projects, was instead pushed to make expansions such as Xanadu Scenario 2, as well as putting games that were, to him, unrelated, all under the same Dragon Slayer banner. The clearest example of this approach was with Sorcerian, the fifth mainline game in the Dragon Slayer series, which launched just after the first Ys game in 1987, following a relatively short development time. It continued to have expansions developed for years after, leaving its development team little opportunity to do something new. But the growing tension between development aspirations and Kato's desires for revenue generation were not just limited to Kia, as others were also beginning to feel the effects of the quick and rapid releases, alongside less than adequate compensation for their efforts. Alongside this, employees who had just moved to a bigger office and had benefited from being able to mingle and share ideas began to see their hobbyist fan culture replaced by one where Kato increasingly made the calls on creative decisions, and hectic, haphazard developments, such as that of Ys 2, led to many developers feeling burnt out and undervalued. But despite these internal struggles, the collective desire to continue making games persisted, thanks in part to a growing industry trend that seemed to dovetail well with Falcom's existing catalogue. Though both Ys and Ys 2 had been top-down action role-playing games, similar in many ways to the look found in both Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, they had played more like updated versions of Nihon Falcom's own earlier efforts with the Dragon Slayer series, with their bump combat and overhead exploration sections. But this inspiration was not limited to just internal Falcom projects, as others in the industry had taken note of Dragon Slayer's winning formula of fantasy action role-playing gameplay and top-down exploration, and they sought to make their own versions. One such game was Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda, released in 1986 for the Famicom Disk System. Seemingly inspired by the gameplay of both Dragon Slayer and its contemporary competitor Hydralide, The Legend of Zelda was Nintendo's take on the fantasy action genre, featuring a large, explorable world map, multiple dungeons complete with puzzles, and fearsome monsters to overcome. The game proved to be a huge success for both the company and its directors, Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. And its success was down to not just the quality of the game, but the fact that the rewritable disk system games were priced much more competitively than their competitors, which in turn got The Legend of Zelda in the hands of even more consumers. Similar to Ys, Zelda was built for a different audience than the more hardcore role-playing games of the era, and simplified a lot of the genre's mechanics to make the gameplay more accessible and rewarding to the average player. Nintendo, though, was not the only company that was hard at work building on Dragon Slayer's legacy, as back at Nihon Falcom, Kia had been expanding the franchise with each new installment. With Xanadu, this saw the introduction of side-scrolling platform exploration sequences, a feature that was continued and built upon with the subsequent 1986 and 87 releases of Dragon Slayer Jr. Romancia and Dragon Slayer IV Drazzle Family. Like the original Dragon Slayer before it, these games proved influential to other developers at the time, and helped to inspire other fusions of the popular side-scrolling action genre and role-playing genres, one of which was none other than the follow-up to The Legend of Zelda, The Adventure of Link. Released in 1987, also for the Famicom Disk System, The Adventure of Link was a pretty big departure from The Legend of Zelda. For this game, Miyamoto stepped into the role of producer, handing directorial duties off to Naoya Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura. They sought to have The Adventure of Link innovate upon what The Legend of Zelda had done, and therefore, instead of returning to the top-down gameplay of the original, The Adventure of Link opted for a mixture of gameplay styles, one that combined an overhead world map similar to Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, with side-scrolling action platforming sections for the game's towns and dungeons. The Adventure of Link also borrowed more heavily from the role-playing genre than The Legend of Zelda had, featuring a level-up system, a rather robust magic system, and even side-scrolling combat segments that occurred when the player interacted with enemies on the world map in between stages, similar to random battles seen in other role-playing games. All of these changes amounted to an experience that was noticeably distinct from The Legend of Zelda, and it proved to be a big success for Nintendo despite its daring design change-ups, ending up as the 5th best-selling game on the Famicom, selling more than 4.3 million copies across its lifetime. It also garnered positive reviews from publications like Famitsu and Family Computer magazine, specifically pointing out that the game's presentation and sound were high points over its predecessor. The game proved that a side-scrolling RPG could reach a wider audience than was first assumed, and in a strange sort of feedback loop, served as an example to Nihon Falcom of how far they could further develop their own ideas. Thus, inspired by the refinements Nintendo had made to their own formula, as well as the earning potential, the team began toying with the idea of making a different kind of Ys. If you're enjoying the video so far, then might we suggest checking out our Patreon? You can find a longer, deeper extended edition of this video, as well as exclusive access to videos on Hydelide and Destiny of an Emperor. By becoming a patron, you'll also get early access to all of our future episodes, as well as podcasts, Discord access, and you can vote on what we cover as our out-of-sequence episode every season. But whether you join us on Patreon or continue to watch us here on YouTube, we just want to say a continued thank you for the support. But now, let's get right into the development of Ys 3: Wanderers from Ys. Following the release of Ys 2 on the 22nd of April 1988, as they had done after the release of Ys, Nihon Falcom's development team instantly set about porting the game to other major Japanese PC formats, such as the PC-98, the Sharp X1, the FM77, and the MSX2. With the release of these ports, efforts on Ys 2 officially wrapped, but there was no time to reflect on what had been accomplished, as the team was thrust into the development of a new project. Except this one wasn't so defined, as the Ys duology had seemingly concluded. Excited to get the chance to work on something new, the team began to experiment with side-scrolling gameplay, with Hashimoto being particularly enthused with the idea as he'd enjoyed playing Nintendo's The Adventure of Link and other similar titles like Konami's Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. The beginning of this new project did come with some internal staff changes though, as some of the core staff left for other projects such as Seigo Okatani and the Koshiro siblings. In addition, new staff joined the team to assist, like graphic designers Tsuyoshi Matsumuro and Yoshimi Sato. At first, development of this new game was focused solely on experimenting with the graphical aspect of side-scrolling, as Hashimoto was obsessed with trying his hand at replicating the parallax scrolling effects that had become commonplace in arcade games, and had started to find their way into home console releases by way of clever programming workarounds. The Ys development team had accomplished a similar effect with Ys 2's Bell Tower, which featured a basic scrolling effect. But Hashimoto believed that by focusing solely on a side-scrolling game, that they would be able to take this idea even further and really impress people. To prototype this concept, the team created a few simple maps and began testing out basic gameplay. They still had no concrete idea as to what the final game was even going to look like, and there was definitely no inkling of any kind of story. Due to there being no real narrative structure or characters yet, the decision was made to use Ys's protagonist as a placeholder for the player-controlled character. And with a placeholder character now in place, the team began building out a variety of environments to experiment with, not putting too much thought into how they might piece together. And they spent a small amount of time trying their best to reverse engineer the mechanics that made the Adventure of Link tick. Not long after this initial prototyping phase, a new staff member then joined the team called Koji Yokota, who was a graphic designer. A recent employee of Nihon Telenet, Yokota had worked on Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei and Valis the Phantasm Soldier, and he was drawn to Nihon Falcom due to his admiration of the graphical techniques they'd used on the first two Ys games. He worked closely with Yoshihiko Kurata and Kazuhiko Suzuki, and he helped the team to create maps for the new project alongside enemy monster graphics. With Yokota's joining, the team was able to make progress quickly, and many of the game's systems began to fall in place, but it was still more or less just a tech demo at this point, and there was no formal title or narrative. But due to the fact that Adol had persisted as the placeholder playable character, the project began to internally gain the moniker Adol's Great Adventure around the offices, and the notion that they should just make this game somehow related to the Ys franchise began to gain some traction. Once the team had started to get a handle on how their new game was actually going to play, they began to fine-tune some of the details. Early on, they already knew this game was going to move away from the bump combat system they had used in the previous two games, as they wanted to create something that featured dedicated key inputs for attacking. And as the maps the team had been building out now featured platforming elements, another dedicated input was going to be assigned to jumping, which also added a new dimension of verticality to the gameplay. This verticality then inspired the team in another way. What if, instead of having the protagonist simply attack and jump, they gave them a multitude of attacking options to add to the depth of combat? As a result, the development team came up with a whole range of ways the player could attack their foes depending on the situation, from upward and downward thrusts to jump and crouching attacks. And though this new game lacked the more open exploration present in the previous games, the side-scrolling format offered the team the chance to build out combat in a way that was much more action-orientated and varied. And this meant it resembled something closer to a side-scrolling action game and a beat-em-up, but with Castlevania's traversal mechanics. The developers did not want this project to just be a simple level-based action game though, and therefore they drew again from contemporaries like The Adventure of Link and Castlevania 2, starting to toy with how they could include role-playing elements into the gameplay. The first way this manifested was how the team essentially carried over a lot of what had worked in Ys, which had been an action-orientated role-playing game in its own right, and they tried to adapt elements to this new gameplay style. This saw the addition of character stats, level up progression mechanics, inventory and equipment UI, and even regenerative health in certain safe areas, such as in towns or the entrances of stages. But these decisions started to create a compound effect, and it meant that although the project had begun as an exploration into a new type of game at Falcom, with so many elements now being incorporated from Ys, more and more people began to think it might as well just be an Ys game. The only challenge was that Miyazaki and Hashimoto did not like this idea. They wanted to leave Ys behind. But Kato and the rest of Falcom's senior management were not all that interested in their wants and desires, and after the decision was taken that it would indeed be transitioned into being another Ys game, the development team had no choice but to find a way to formalize their new project as just that, and they had to come up with a story that then made sense to what they had previously told. Hashimoto and Miyazaki, given their reticence, weren't really sure what kind of story they could tell. They had gone into Ys 2 with no real plan, and that was a struggle, but for that game they at least knew they were going to make a second game, and they therefore had a desire to make it work and conclude the story. But now they had to try and work with a story that had been concluded, without that same desire to make a third game. This created something of a quandary, but if it absolutely had to be an Ys game, the easiest option they could think of was to create it as a side story for adult, rather than a direct continuation. This meant it would focus on a new adventure that was unrelated to the previous one, save for including a few returning characters to tie everything together. Thus, the decision was made to focus the tale on an adventure in Felghana, the homeland of one of Ys's more important NPCs, with Adol then investigating strange happenings going on in the region. Though not wholly dissimilar from Adol's quest in the previous two games, this premise at least allowed the team to start stitching together the myriad of maps they created while prototyping into something that supported narrative progression, and they created a central hub town that was designed to connect all the stages together. Progression through these stages was then made to be more or less linear, abandoning the freer exploration of Ys with specific criteria that needed to be met in order to unlock the next area. The stages could be returned to for additional experience and exploration if the player so chose, which helped give the game more of a role-playing feel as opposed to being an action game with light RPG elements. Seeing as the game was now being cast in the mold of Ys, even more elements from the series began to make an appearance, such as the ability to save anywhere, multiple equipment upgrades for Adol, and magic rings, accessories which provided the player with multiple ways to augment Adol's abilities in combat. With all these elements in place, the game was now starting to properly resemble an entry in the Ys series, albeit one that was designed to sit in a different genre. Behind the scenes though, things were growing very tense at the offices, and Hashimoto and Miyazaki were becoming more and more frustrated with Kato, something that stemmed from his decision to turn their new project into another Ys game. Things started to come to a head at the end of 1988, after a good deal of the groundwork had already been laid down on the game. The end of the summer had actually seen the departure of Kurata, who, after helping to create some map compression and decompression software during the early stages of development, started to pull away from Falcom, and eventually left altogether, in part due to disagreements around compensation. And by the time 1989 had rolled around, Suzuki had also made his exit from the company, leaving Yokota to finish off the game's graphics by himself. Around this time, Hashimoto began to have more frequent meetings with Kato, meetings where the two clearly did not see eye to eye, and the result was the creation of a fractured development environment that pitted the ones who were making the games against the people who ran the company. It was during this time that naming of the game caused a lot of friction. Hashimoto was not keen to have the game labelled as Ys 3, no doubt because he was worried about confusion amongst the consumer base, so they chose to compromise, titling the game Wanderers from Ys. Unbeknownst to Kato though, his demands were leading developers to create contingency plans. Since the beginning of development, Hashimoto and Miyazaki had expressed to some members of staff that this project would be their final game at Nihon Falcom, as they wanted a space to create their own games, and more importantly, they wanted to answer to their own schedules instead of Kato's. With how things were progressing with the development of Wanderers, they felt vindicated in their thoughts and decided that they were going to proceed. But despite all of these issues, development still continued, and throughout January of 1989, the team made good progress towards finishing the project. It meant by the end of February, the game was nearly complete, save for a few final details, and although the development team had hemorrhaged some key members, Wanderers from East was starting to resemble a finished product. But then, another blow was struck, as both Hashimoto and Miyazaki could no longer stand working for the company, and upon finishing their principal development, resigned. In less than a month of their resignation, the pair launched a new development studio called Quintet, and they reconnected with ex-Falcom employees like the Koshiro siblings, a move that was hard not to view as an act of defiance from the frustrated developers. But even though nearly all the key development staff from the original East were now gone, Wanderers was ostensibly complete. What's more, the game had already been publicly teased by Nihon Falcom as far back as the decision to make the game a proper entry in the East series at the end of 1988, with ads for the title even beginning to appear in computer magazines. But with the sudden departure of such senior figures, the ads stopped appearing, and the decision came down from the top that the release date was to be quietly moved to the summer. In the months that followed, the remaining team members worked to try and polish Wanderers, a role which mainly fell to Yokota. And with no resistance anymore, the game's name was changed, formally retitled to East 3, Wanderers from East, cementing it once and for all as the third official entry in the East series beyond a shadow of a doubt, even though that was never the intention of the game's creators. Due to all of the internal issues, East 3 was pushed back by quite a few months, which, given the rapid pace at which Nihon Falcom operated at, was a pretty significant delay. It wasn't until June of 1989 that the company started talking about the game again, and the public were given a taste of this newly rebranded East project via in-store demos and PC magazines. And only the most astute of game fans would have really been able to read between the lines and notice that something must have been going on at Falcom for them to tease a game before hiding it completely for a couple of months, only to have it re-emerge with a new branding. It meant the promotional campaign for East 3 ended up being short and sharp, with Nihon Falcom banking on the fact that fans of the first two games were eagerly awaiting Adol's next big excursion. To help players figure out how East 3 was connected, just as they had done with the previous two games, a beautiful game manual was commissioned, complete with hand-drawn art and detailed story exposition. And this highlighted that even though the game had been delayed and had taken quite a different direction in terms of gameplay, Falcom had still taken steps to ensure that East 3 felt like a proper continuation of the series. And because of this, they also had reason to believe that the product they were releasing would translate into another success for them, as Kia's continued efforts in expanding Sorcerian had kept Nihon Falcom's name near or at the top of Login Magazine's Softlock Top 30 well into 1989, alongside East 2. What's more, thanks to all of Hashimoto's efforts before he left, the game featured an incredible parallax scrolling effect, and they were confident that the game's in-store demos would, like its predecessors, win over computer game fans with their impressive presentation and graphical effects. Luckily for them, these assumptions proved to be more or less true. East 3, Wanderers from East, released in Japan on the 21st of July 1989 on the PC-88, with the PC-98 version following a week later. While essentially the same, these two versions did offer slightly different experiences, with the PC-98 version offering the usual performance and presentation enhancements that better hardware can bring, in addition to selectable difficulty modes which could be chosen upon starting a new game. Though exact sales figures were never released, the game charted well in Login Magazine's Softlock Top 30, staying there throughout the fourth quarter of 1989's calendar year and proving that the game had found its audience. But despite this, not all the reception at the time was positive, and Kato even noted himself that people had not responded quite as well to the shifting gameplay styles as they had hoped. Still, this didn't stop Falcom from repeating what had worked well for them in the past, and they worked with King Records to put out two commercial releases for the game's soundtrack. One based on the music from the PC-88 version of the game, and the other a collection of rearrangements from the game's composer, Meiko Ishikawa, which was released to accompany an additional port of the game for the MSX2. In many ways, East 3 had been facing an uphill battle since its conception, a battle which continued even after its release, as within its initial release window, it soon found itself competing with its own past in the form of East Book 1 and 2. Released in December of 1989 for NEC's new 16-bit console, the PC Engine, and developed by Alpha Systems and Hudson Soft, East Book 1 and 2 was a complete remake of the first two East games in a single package. and it featured overhauled graphics, gameplay, voice acting, and animated anime-style cutscenes. Released to some of the highest critical acclaim the series have received up to that point, including a 35 out of 40 from Famitsu, the hype surrounding Ys Book 1 and 2 only served to highlight Ys 3's differences from the rest of the franchise, and proved to Nihon Falcom that their gamble on an Adventure of Link-style game hadn't quite panned out the way they had hoped. Still, this didn't stop them from moving ahead with one more contemporary port for the game, this time for Sharp's X68000. This version came out the following year in March 1990, and was essentially the same as the PC-98 version, albeit with slightly smoother graphics due to the expanded colour palette. However, its MIDI soundtrack was noticeably different from the original, though it did feature a few extra compositions by Kawai Masaki, a new Nihon Falcom recruit who joined in 1989. Despite this, to coincide with its launch, the X86000 version also saw the commercial release of its soundtrack through King Records, titled Ys 3 JDK Special. This release had new arrangements of songs from the game, alongside the first appearance of the JDK Band, Falcom's in-house production band started by Maiko Ashikawa. It was notable for being the last cassette tape release to come out under Falcom's record label arrangement with King Records. As the release of Ys 3 coincided with not only the release of NEC's PC Engine, but also the more widespread adoption of Sega's 16-bit Mega Drive, it should come as no surprise that, like with past Ys games, Nihon Falcom eventually made the decision to port the game to this new generation of home consoles, both for Japanese and Western markets. Like with past games, they worked again with third-party companies in order to develop and release these various versions, keeping what remained for their own staff to work on the PC ports. For whatever reason, this decision was not made quickly though, as the first of the home console ports, which was for the PC Engine, didn't release until the 22nd of March 1991, a year after the release of the X68000 version, which itself was released the spring following the game's original PC-88 release. However, the PC Engine version was the only 16-bit home console that Falcom head Kato truly believed in, as the company that manufactured it, NEC, was the same company responsible for the PC-88 and PC-98, which had been Falcom's preferred PC platform. So, Nihon Falcom worked with developer Hudson Soft to ensure this version of the game was to be the definitive home console offering. Thus, like the stellar Ys Book 1 and 2, Ys 3 Wanderers from Ys on the PC Engine was a robust package, with improved graphics over the PC original, newly tuned difficulty, and added animated cutscenes. This version also featured high-quality CD audio, featuring rearranged versions of the game's soundtrack by Ys series collaborator, composer Ryo Yonemitsu, who had worked with Nihon Falcom on their King Records commercial soundtrack releases in the past. While the PC Engine version of Ys 3 didn't quite hit the heights of Ys Book 1 and 2, it did score favourably with critics both in Japan and abroad. Video Games and Computer Entertainment gave the TurboGrafx CD version an 8 out of 10, and Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it an aggregated score of 7.5 out of 10. 1991 also saw the release of the Super Famicom version, developed by Advanced Communications, and the Sega Mega Drive version, developed by Telenet. And although they were similar to the PC Engine version, they featured some changes in order to get the game to work on those systems. On the Super Famicom, this most noticeably came in the form of a less than stellar adaptation of the game's soundtrack to accommodate for the system's sound chip, a problem not seen with the Mega Drive version because its FM synthesis more accurately captured the sounds of the original PC-88 release. It was these releases of Ys 3 that most Western gamers were familiar with, primarily due to the install bases of the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. But critically, these games fared similarly to the TurboGrafx 16 version of the game, again suffering from being constantly compared to Ys Book 1 and 2. Curiously though, the most interesting port of Ys 3 in this era was the Famicom port, which, like the Super Famicom port, was handled by Advanced Communications and published by Victor Interactive Software, similar to past Ys Famicom ports. It was a downgraded version of the Super Famicom entry in every single way, and was only released in Japan. But it paradoxically came out after the Super Famicom version had already hit shelves, perhaps an indication that Victor Interactive Software were just casting a net as wide as they could to see what they would get in return. While an ambitious idea, Ys 3 Wanderers from Ys was somewhat divisive upon launch due to how much it diverged from the established core, and it continues to be seen that way to this day. In the end, despite the talent that was at Nihon Falcom when the project started, the game's development was rather winding, starting out as an unrelated prototype before being morphed into the next entry in the Ys series. In addition, the process was marred by internal company troubles that unfortunately wound up being too much for the development team to bear. This caused many key members like Hashimoto and Miyazaki to leave Nihon Falcom before the game was complete. Ultimately, this left Ys 3 in a bit of an odd place, as it was the last game in the series to be worked on by the creators of the Ys franchise, but it was also one of the big reasons why they wound up leaving, making Ys 3, Wanderers of Ys, a monument to the end of the first era of Ys games and the beginning of a new era for Nihon Falcom as a company. But with that, thank you so much for watching, everyone. My name is Darryl, and together with Colin and Chris, we hope you've enjoyed listening to the incredible development history of Ys 3. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing a video like this by giving it a like. We'd also like to give a massive thanks to everyone who supports us on Patreon, as they allow us to create extensive videos like this. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.